The water hit my lungs like liquid fire, and all I could hear was my grandson's laughter echoing from above as I sank into that murky river. 22 years old, standing on that bridge, watching his own grandfather drown, and laughing. Laughing like it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. But let me tell you something. If you've ever felt the cold grip of betrayal from someone you'd die for, someone you raised with your own two hands, then you need to hear this story. Because what happened next changed everything. And I mean everything. Hit that subscribe button right now, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why revenge isn't always about getting even. Sometimes it's about teaching someone the hardest lesson they'll ever learn. My name is Clayton Briggs, and I'm 73 years old. I've lived through wars, buried a wife, raised children, and built a life with these weathered hands. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what my own blood would do to me on that October afternoon. You see, it all started with a phone call 3 months earlier. My grandson Jake, my daughter Sarah's boy, had just graduated from some fancy college back east. Harvard, Princeton, one of those places that cost more than I made in 5 years working the docks. The kid had always been smart, I'll give him that. Sharp as a tack, could argue circles around anyone, make you feel small with just a look. But somewhere along the way, he picked up this attitude. This way of looking at people like me, working folks, people who never had the luxury of 4 years in ivory towers, like we were specimens under a microscope. Like we were less than. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was fixing the fence around my property when the phone rang inside the house. Sarah's voice was strained, tired in a way that only comes from dealing with impossible children. "Dad, I need to ask you a favor," she said, and I could already hear the weight of it in her words. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "It's Jake. He's been having some trouble adjusting since graduation. Lost his job at that consulting firm in New York. Says he needs some time to figure things out." I set down my coffee mug, staring out at the morning fog rolling across my 40 acres. This land had been in our family for 3 generations. My grandfather had cleared it by hand, built the first cabin with logs he cut himself. My father had expanded it, and I'd spent the better part of 50 years making it what it was, a place where a man could find peace. "You want him to come stay with me for a while. Just until he gets back on his feet. I know you two haven't always seen eye to eye, but Sarah, the boy thinks I'm some kind of backwoods fool. Last time he was here, he spent the whole weekend correcting my grammar and explaining to me why everything I believe is wrong." There was silence on the other end. Then, quietly, "He's lost, Dad. I think being away from the city, spending time with you, maybe it'll ground him. Remind him where he comes from." Where he comes from. That's what she said. As if this place, this life I'd built, was something to be ashamed of instead of proud of. But Jake was my grandson. My own blood. And despite everything, despite the way he looked at me like I was some relic from a bygone era, I loved that boy. I'd held him when he was born, taught him to fish in the creek that runs through my property, listened to his dreams when he was small and still thought his grandfather hung the moon. "All right," I told Sarah. "Send him on down." 2 weeks later, Jake pulled up in his fancy German sedan, all black paint and chrome that probably cost more than my truck was worth. He stepped out wearing clothes that screamed money, designer jeans, some kind of jacket that looked like it came from a magazine, shoes so polished you could see your reflection. I walked out to meet him, wiping my hands on a rag. I'd been working on the tractor all morning, trying to fix a hydraulic line that had been giving me trouble. "Grandfather," he said, not Grandpa or Pop like he used to call me. "Thank you for letting me stay." There was something different about his voice. Colder. More formal. Like he was talking to a stranger instead of the man who'd taught him to ride a bike. "Course, Jake. This is your family's land. Always room for family here." He looked around at the property. The old farmhouse I'd renovated myself, the barn where I kept my tools and equipment, the pasture where I still ran a few head of cattle. His expression was critical. Like he was examining everything and finding it wanting. "It's very rustic," he said finally. "Rustic," Like it was a disease. We went inside, and I showed him to his room, the same room his mother had grown up in, the same room where I'd read him bedtime stories when he was little and spent summers here. The walls were still covered with the same pine paneling my father had installed, the furniture was solid oak pieces I'd built myself over the years. Jake set his expensive suitcase on the bed and looked around like he was afraid he might catch something. "The Wi-Fi signal is pretty weak out here," I said, trying to make conversation. "But it's good enough for whatever you need to do on that computer of yours." He pulled out his phone, frowned at the screen. "What's the password for the network?" "Don't have one. Never saw the need." The look he gave me, like I just told him I didn't believe in electricity. "You don't secure your wireless network?" "Grandfather, that's incredibly irresponsible. Anyone could access your personal information, your banking data." "Jake, the nearest neighbor is 3 miles away, and old Mrs. Henderson barely knows how to use the telephone. I think my banking information is safe." He shook his head, that condescending smile I'd grown to recognize spreading across his face. "You really need to educate yourself about cybersecurity. The digital age isn't going anywhere, and willful ignorance isn't charming anymore." Willful ignorance. That's what my own grandson called my way of life. But I bit my tongue. Sarah had asked me to help the boy, and I was going to try. The first week wasn't terrible. Jake kept to himself mostly, spending hours on his laptop in his room or sitting on the front porch with his phone pressed to his ear, having conversations with people from his old life. I could hear fragments through the windows, complaints about being stuck in the middle of nowhere, jokes about roughing it, like he was on some kind of survival show. I tried to engage him. Asked if he wanted to help me repair the dock down by the creek, or if he'd like to come into town with me when I ran errands. Each time, he declined with that same polite, distant smile. "I'm really focusing on my job search right now, Grandfather. I need to get back to the real world as soon as possible." The real world. As if the life I'd built, the community I'd been part of for 7 decades, wasn't real. But it was during the second week that things started to change. That's when Jake began to educate me. It started small. Corrections about the way I talked, suggestions about how I could improve myself. When I mentioned something I'd heard on the news, he'd launch into lengthy explanations about why I was wrong, why the sources I trusted were unreliable, why my perspective was limited by my lack of education. "You know, Grandfather," he said one morning over breakfast, "you really should expand your media consumption. The local news and talk radio aren't giving you a complete picture of what's happening in the world." I was eating eggs from my own chickens, bacon from a pig I'd raised myself, drinking coffee I'd brewed from beans I'd ground by hand. Simple pleasures that had sustained me for decades. "I get by just fine with what I know, Jake. But that's the problem, you don't know what you don't know. There's so much more to understand about economics, politics, social justice. You're living in a bubble. A bubble. My life, my work, my community, the values I'd learned from my father and his father before him, was a bubble." "Maybe," I said carefully, "there's value in the kind of knowledge that comes from living, from working with your hands, from being part of a community for your whole life." Jake laughed. Actually laughed. "Grandfather, anecdotal experience isn't the same as real knowledge. What you're talking about is folksy wisdom, but the world is complex. It requires actual education to understand." I set down my fork, looked at this young man I'd loved since the day he was born. "Jake, I may not have gone to fancy schools, but I've been around for 7 decades. I've seen things, learned things. From a very limited perspective." He interrupted. "That's not your fault. You're a product of your generation and your environment. But you shouldn't mistake your narrow experience for universal truth." Narrow experience. Limited perspective. Product of my generation. Each phrase hit like a slap, but I kept my temper. This was Sarah's son. My grandson. He was just confused, maybe hurting from losing his job, lashing out at the world. But it got worse. Jake started treating me like his personal improvement project. Every conversation became a lecture about something I was doing wrong, some way I could better myself if I just listened to his superior knowledge. When I mentioned that I'd voted for the same man for sheriff for the past 20 years because he'd done right by our community, Jake launched into a dissertation about how local politics were more complex than I understood, how I was being manipulated by empty rhetoric and false promises. When I talked about the satisfaction of growing my own food, he explained how my small-scale farming was inefficient and environmentally irresponsible compared to modern agricultural methods. When I mentioned that I'd been thinking about getting a new truck, he spent an hour telling me why I should buy a hybrid vehicle, complete with statistics and charts he pulled up on his laptop. Every single thing I said, every opinion I expressed, every choice I made, all of it was wrong, according to Jake. All of it needed to be corrected, improved, educated. And through it all, he never raised his voice. Never got angry or hostile. He maintained that same patient, condescending tone you'd use with a child who just couldn't grasp basic concepts. "I'm not trying to be mean, grandfather. I'm trying to help you grow as a person. There's always room for self-improvement." Self-improvement. Like everything about me, everything I was, needed fixing. But the breaking point came 3 weeks into his stay. I was working in the garden behind the house, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants, when Jake came out with his laptop. "Grandfather, I've been doing some research, and I think I can help you optimize this whole operation." I looked up from the dirt, saw him standing there in his clean clothes, holding his expensive computer, looking at my garden like it was a problem to be solved. "What do you mean, optimize?" He opened the laptop, started showing me charts and graphs. "Well, for starters, your crop selection is all wrong. You're growing varieties that are inefficient in terms of yield per square foot. And your irrigation system is primitive, you're wasting water and not providing optimal moisture distribution." I stood up slowly, feeling the ache in my knees that comes from 73 years of hard work. "Jake, this garden has fed my family for decades. My father taught me how to work this soil, and his father taught him." "Right, but that's exactly the problem. You're using outdated methods based on tradition instead of science. I found this agricultural extension service website that has all the latest research on maximizing garden productivity." He turned the laptop toward me, showing me pages filled with technical diagrams and scientific terminology. "If you implemented just these basic improvements, you could increase your yield by 30% while reducing water usage and labor time." I stared at that screen, at all those charts and numbers that were supposed to tell me how to work land I'd known since I was a boy. Land that had been in my family for 3 generations. "You know what your problem is, Jake?" He looked up from the laptop, that patient smile still on his face. "What's that, grandfather? You think knowing something from a book is the same as understanding it in your bones?" The smile faltered slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean." I gestured toward the garden, toward the neat rows of plants I'd nurtured from seeds. "This isn't just about yield per square foot or moisture distribution. This is about understanding the rhythms of the land, knowing how the soil feels in different weather, recognizing when plants are healthy just by looking at them." Jake closed the laptop with a soft click. "Grandfather, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're romanticizing inefficient practices and calling it wisdom. Maybe. Or maybe there are some things that can't be learned from a computer screen." He stood up, and for a moment, I saw something different in his eyes. Not just condescension now, but something harder. Something that looked almost like contempt. "You know what your real problem is?" he said, his voice still calm but with an edge I hadn't heard before. "You're afraid of growth. You're comfortable being unschooled." Unschooled. That word hit different than all the others. It wasn't just about education or knowledge, it was about worth. About whether a man like me had any value in the world Jake lived in. I looked at my grandson, this young man I loved, I tried to help, and I realized something that should have been obvious weeks ago. He didn't just think I was wrong about things. He thought I was less than him. Fundamentally, irredeemably less than. "I think," I said quietly, "it might be time for you to head back to your mother's place." Jake's expression didn't change. "Fine. I was getting tired of trying to help someone who doesn't want to be helped anyway." He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving me standing in my garden with dirt under my fingernails and a cold feeling in my chest that had nothing to do with the October weather. But he didn't leave. Not that day, not the next. He kept finding excuses, needed to finish some job applications, was waiting for a call about an interview, had to wrap up some project he was working on. And the condescension got worse. Much worse. The next morning, Jake didn't just stay, he doubled down on his mission to fix everything wrong with my life. I found him in the kitchen at dawn, reorganizing my cabinets with the same methodical precision he might have used for a corporate presentation. "Good morning, grandfather," he said without looking up from the shelf of coffee mugs he was rearranging. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of organizing your kitchen storage for maximum efficiency." I stood there in my pajamas, watching my own grandson treat my home like it was his personal renovation project. The mugs I'd collected over decades, some from local diners, others gifts from friends, each one carrying memories, were now arranged by size and color in perfect, sterile rows. "Jake, I knew where everything was before." He turned, that patient educator's smile firmly in place. "I'm sure you did, but organization is about more than just knowing where things are. It's about creating systems that optimize your daily routines." Optimize. Everything with him was about optimization, efficiency, systems. Like life was nothing more than a series of problems to be solved with the right algorithm. I poured myself coffee from the pot he'd apparently reorganized as well. Different placement, different timing, different everything. It tasted the same, but somehow it felt wrong in my hands. "I also took the liberty of going through your financial records," Jake continued, pulling out a folder thick with papers. "Your filing system is concerning." My blood pressure spiked. "You went through my personal papers?" I was trying to help. "Look, I understand that money management can be overwhelming for someone without financial education, but you're making some serious mistakes." He spread out bank statements, tax returns, insurance documents across my kitchen table like evidence in a criminal case. "Your investment strategy is completely backwards. You're keeping too much money in low-yield savings accounts, your retirement planning is inadequate, and don't even get me started on your insurance coverage." I sat down heavily, staring at 40 years of careful financial decisions being dissected by someone who'd been unemployed for 3 months. "Jake, I've managed to keep this place running, raise a family, and put money away for retirement. I think I'm doing fine." "But that's exactly the problem. You think fine is good enough. With proper financial planning, you could have had twice as much saved. 3 times as much." He pulled out his laptop, started showing me spreadsheets and graphs. "I ran some projections based on your income history. If you had just made smarter choices 20 years ago, you'd be in a completely different position now." Smarter choices. Every decision I'd made, every sacrifice, every careful calculation to make sure my family was provided for, reduced to poor financial planning by someone who never had to choose between fixing the roof and buying new shoes for his children. "You know what I think, Jake?" "What's that, grandfather?" "I think you're so busy trying to prove how much smarter you are than everyone else that you've forgotten what actually matters." His fingers paused over the keyboard. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that all your education, all your optimization and efficiency, what has it actually gotten you? You lost your job, you're living in your grandfather's house, and you spend every day trying to tear down other people to make yourself feel better." For just a moment, I saw something crack in that composed facade. A flash of anger, of hurt, of something real underneath all the intellectual superiority. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same cold smile. "You're deflecting because you can't handle criticism," he said, closing the laptop with deliberate calm. "It's a defense mechanism common among people who aren't used to having their assumptions challenged." Defense mechanism. Psychological terminology deployed like a weapon, clinical and cutting. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I'm just tired of being treated like I'm stupid by someone I raised." Jake stood up, gathering the papers with mechanical precision. "I'm not treating you like you're stupid, grandfather. I'm treating you like someone who could benefit from education." There's a difference. But there wasn't a difference, not really. Both meant the same thing, that everything I was, everything I'd learned, everything I'd built with my own two hands, none of it had any value in his world. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as helpful suggestions. Jake found fault with everything: the way I maintained my equipment, the route I took to town, the books I read, the television shows I watched, the food I ate. Each criticism was delivered with scientific precision, backed by research he'd found online, wrapped in the language of improvement and growth. Never angry, never hostile, just relentlessly, systematically diminishing. When I mentioned that I'd been having trouble sleeping, he launched into a lecture about sleep hygiene, showing me studies about optimal room temperature, mattress firmness, and pre-sleep routines. "Your bedroom setup is all wrong," he said, standing in the doorway of the room I'd shared with my wife for 30 years before she passed. "The furniture placement disrupts natural circadian rhythms, and that old mattress is probably causing more problems than you realize." When I tried to show him how to use some of my woodworking tools, thinking maybe we could find common ground in creating something together, he immediately started researching better techniques online. "Grandfather, your joinery methods are really outdated. Look, this YouTube channel shows much more efficient ways to achieve the same results." Even my grief became a subject for his expertise. When I mentioned missing my wife, especially in the evenings when we used to sit on the porch together, Jake had psychological insights to offer. "You know, studies show that prolonged grieving can be a sign of depression. There are resources available, therapy, support groups, medications that could help you process these feelings more effectively. Like love and loss were just data to be optimized, emotions to be managed with the right therapeutic algorithm." But the worst part wasn't the constant criticism. The worst part was watching this young man, this boy I'd held as a baby, taught to fish, cheered for at school plays, systematically erase every trace of warmth between us. He stopped calling me grandfather, switching to a formal, Clayton, that made me feel like a stranger in my own home. He stopped eating the meals I prepared, ordering food from town instead because my cooking didn't meet his dietary standards. He stopped engaging in any conversation that wasn't directly related to some deficiency in my life that needed correcting. It was like living with a polite, well-educated stranger who'd appointed himself my personal life coach without my consent. And through it all, he never lost that patient, reasonable tone. Never raised his voice or showed anger. Just maintained that steady, clinical approach to dismantling everything I was. But I could see something else building underneath all that control. Something harder and colder than mere condescension. When he thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch glimpses of genuine contempt in his eyes. Not just disapproval or disappointment, but actual disgust. Like being around me, being related to me, was somehow degrading to him. The final straw came on a Thursday afternoon. I was fixing a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm, using techniques my father had taught me, methods that had kept this property secure for decades. Jake appeared with his laptop, as always, ready to show me the error of my ways. "You know, there are much more efficient fencing systems available now," he said, pulling up websites filled with modern materials and installation methods. "What you're doing is basically 19th century technology." I drove another post into the ground, feeling the satisfaction of solid work, honest labor. "This fence will outlast both of us, Jake. But at what cost? The time investment, the maintenance requirements, the inefficient use of materials, none of it makes sense from an economic standpoint." I straightened up, wiped sweat from my forehead. "Not everything is about economics, son. Actually, everything is about economics. Resource allocation, opportunity cost, return on investment, these concepts apply to every decision you make, whether you understand them or not." Every decision I made. My whole life reduced to an economics problem that I was apparently too ignorant to solve correctly. I set down my post-hole diggers, really looked at my grandson for the first time in weeks. When had he become this person? When had the bright, curious boy who used to help me with farm chores turned into someone who saw everything I did as evidence of my intellectual inadequacy? Jake, can I ask you something? Of course. When you look at me, what do you see? He seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. What do you mean? I mean, when you look at your grandfather, the man who held you when you were born, who taught you to ride a bike, who loved you before you even knew what love was, what do you see? For a moment, his composed mask slipped. I saw confusion there, maybe even a flicker of the boy he used to be. But then the clinical detachment returned. I see someone with a lot of potential who's been held back by circumstance and lack of opportunity, he said carefully. Someone who could benefit from guidance and education. Potential. Like I was raw material waiting to be shaped into something useful. You don't see your grandfather anymore, do you? You just see a project. Jake's expression hardened slightly. I see someone who's resistant to growth and change. Someone who's comfortable being unschooled. There was that word again. Unschooled. But this time, he said it with something approaching venom. I picked up my tools, started walking back toward the house. I think it's time for you to go, Jake. Really time. He followed me, his voice rising slightly for the first time since he'd arrived. So that's it. When someone tries to help you improve yourself, you just shut down? I stopped, turned to face him. Improved myself into what? A copy of you? Into someone who isn't limited by ignorance and pride. Ignorance and pride. There it was, finally out in the open. The real problem wasn't my methods or my choices, it was me. Fundamentally, irredeemably me. You know what, Jake? You're right. I am ignorant about a lot of things. I never went to college, never learned to talk pretty or think in spreadsheets. But I know one thing your fancy education never taught you. What's that? I know how to respect the people who came before me. I know how to honor the knowledge that gets passed down through generations of people who worked with their hands and built something real. Jake laughed, actually laughed. Grandfather, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're confusing tradition with truth, sentiment with wisdom. Maybe. But at least I know the difference between being educated and being wise. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're using folksy sayings to avoid confronting uncomfortable realities about yourself. I stared at this young man, this stranger wearing my grandson's face, and felt something die inside me. Not anger, not hurt, just a cold, empty recognition that the boy I'd loved was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as nothing more than an embarrassing reminder of his humble origins. Pack your things, I said quietly. I want you gone by tomorrow. Jake's eyes flashed with something that might have been triumph. Fine. I was getting tired of wasting my time trying to help someone who doesn't want to be helped. He turned and walked toward the house, leaving me standing in the shadow of the fence I'd built with my own hands, holding tools my father had passed down to me, feeling more alone than I had since the day my wife died. But Jake didn't leave the next morning. Or the morning after that. Instead, he got worse. Jake didn't just ignore my request for him to leave, he acted like I'd never made it. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen again, reorganizing something else, humming softly to himself like he didn't have a care in the world. Morning, Clayton, he said without looking up from whatever project he'd assigned himself. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Our conversation. Like it had been a friendly chat instead of me telling him to get out of my house. Jake, I thought I made myself clear. You did. And I think I understand the real problem now. He turned to face me, that patient educator's expression firmly back in place. You're experiencing what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. When people are confronted with information that challenges their core beliefs, they often react with hostility rather than openness. Cognitive dissonance. Even my anger at being disrespected in my own home was just another psychological concept for him to analyze and explain away. The fact that you want me to leave instead of engaging with the feedback I'm offering, that's actually a pretty common defense mechanism. Defense mechanism. Every response I had to his behavior was just more evidence of my psychological shortcomings. I poured coffee with shaking hands, trying to keep my temper in check. Jake, this isn't about psychology or feedback. This is about respect. You've been in my home for a month, treating me like I'm some kind of charity case that needs fixing. I've been trying to help you reach your potential. But if you'd rather stay comfortable in your limitations, that's your choice. Stay comfortable in your limitations. He made it sound like I was choosing to be inferior, like personal growth was just a matter of accepting his superior judgment about everything. My limitations? I repeated. You mean like the limitation of thinking a man deserves to be treated with dignity in his own home? Jake sighed, the way you might sigh at a particularly stubborn child. Clayton, dignity isn't about avoiding difficult truths. Real dignity comes from facing your shortcomings and working to overcome them. Real dignity. According to my 22-year-old grandson who never built anything, never struggled to keep a family fed, never made hard choices with no good options. You want to know what I think, Jake? Of course. I think you lost your job because nobody could stand working with you. I think you came here because you had nowhere else to go, and now you're taking out all your frustration and failure on the one person who was willing to help you. For just a moment, I saw real anger flash across his face. Raw, unguarded fury that told me I'd hit something true. But then the mask slipped back into place, smoother than ever. That's an interesting theory, he said, his voice perfectly controlled. But projection is another common defense mechanism. When people feel attacked, they often try to turn the criticism back on the person offering it. Projection. Defense mechanism. Clinical terminology used like armor against any possibility that he might be wrong about anything. But I could see something different in his eyes now. Something harder and more focused. Like he'd made some kind of decision. Over the next 3 days, Jake's behavior changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. The pretense of helpfulness disappeared, replaced by something that felt almost experimental. Like he was testing how far he could push before I broke. He started commenting on everything I did, but now the suggestions carried an edge of mockery barely concealed beneath the academic language. When I was working on the tractor, trying to replace a worn bearing, he appeared with his laptop and a condescending smile. You know, Clayton, I've been researching mechanical repair techniques, and your approach is really quite primitive. There are much more systematic ways to diagnose engine problems. When I mentioned that I was planning to visit old Mrs. Henderson down the road because she'd been feeling poorly, he had insights to offer about the psychology of elderly social interaction. You might want to consider that your visits could actually be enabling her dependency rather than helping her develop coping mechanisms for her isolation. When I tried to watch the evening news, something I'd done for decades to stay connected with what was happening in the world, he'd sit beside me offering running commentary about media bias and the intellectual limitations of local journalism. It's really quite sad how easily manipulated people become when they don't have the critical thinking skills to analyze what they're consuming. Every single thing I did, every choice I made, every habit I developed over 7 decades of living, all of it became material for his increasingly cruel analysis. But it was the way he said, people, that really got to me. Never you, directly, always. People. Like I was just another specimen of some lower form of humanity he was studying. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning. I was getting ready for church, something I'd done every Sunday for as long as I could remember, not because I was particularly religious, but because it connected me to my community, to traditions that had sustained my family for generations. Jake was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop, as always, when I came downstairs wearing my Sunday clothes. Going to church? He asked, not looking up from whatever he was reading. Every Sunday for the past 60 years. Interesting. I've been reading about the psychology of religious belief in rural communities. It's quite fascinating from an anthropological perspective. Anthropological perspective. Like my faith, my community, my entire way of life was just an interesting cultural artifact to be studied and categorized. You know, he continued, finally looking up with that clinical smile. There's quite a bit of research on how religious participation functions as a coping mechanism for people who feel powerless in their daily lives. Coping mechanism. My relationship with God, with my community, with the spiritual traditions that had given my life meaning, reduced to psychological weakness. Jake, some things don't need to be analyzed and explained. Some things just are. But that's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people trapped in cycles of ignorance. The unexamined life isn't worth living, Socrates said that. The unexamined life. More intellectual superiority disguised as wisdom, more evidence that everything about my existence was somehow insufficient. I started to respond, then stopped. What was the point? Every word I said would just become more material for his analysis, more proof of my intellectual limitations. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. Clayton, Jake called after me, his voice carrying a strange note I hadn't heard before. Almost eager. You know, if you ever want to have a real conversation about why you believe what you believe, I'd be happy to help you work through some of those assumptions. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. What kind of conversation? Well, for instance, how do you reconcile belief in an all-powerful, benevolent deity with the reality of suffering in the world? It's a classic theological problem that most people haven't really thought through. Most people. There it was again. The casual dismissal of everyone who wasn't him, everyone who hadn't been blessed with his superior education and insight. I'll think about it, I said, and left for church. But I couldn't concentrate during the service. Reverend Miller's sermon about forgiveness and family kept getting interrupted by Jake's voice in my head, analyzing and dismissing everything I heard. By the time I got home, I was angrier than I'd been in years. Jake was waiting for me in the living room, laptop open, looking like he'd been preparing for something. How was church? He asked, that same eager tone in his voice. Fine. Did you think about what we discussed? About examining your beliefs? I set my keys on the table, looked at my grandson, this stranger who'd taken over his body and his name. You really want to have this conversation? Absolutely. I think it could be very beneficial for you. Beneficial for me. Even my potential spiritual crisis would be good for me, according to Jake's superior judgment. All right, I said, sitting down across from him. Let's talk about beliefs. For the next hour, Jake systematically dismantled everything I'd ever found meaningful or sacred. Not with anger or hostility, but with the same patient, clinical precision he'd been using to tear apart every other aspect of my life. He questioned the logic of prayer, the historical accuracy of biblical stories, the sociological function of religious community. Every answer I gave was met with more questions, more research he'd found online, more evidence that my beliefs were nothing more than psychological comfort mechanisms for someone too intellectually limited to face reality. I'm not trying to attack your faith, Clayton, he said when I finally stopped responding to his questions. I'm just encouraging you to think critically about why you believe what you believe. Think critically. As if 73 years of living, of struggling, of finding meaning in the midst of loss and hardship, was somehow less valuable than his ability to find contradictions in ancient texts. You done? I asked quietly. Well, I think we've made some good progress. The important thing is that you're starting to question assumptions you've never examined before. Question assumptions. Challenge beliefs. Examine everything. Jake's entire worldview boiled down to tearing things apart without ever building anything to replace them. I stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the land my grandfather had cleared with his own hands. 3 generations of work, of faith, of family, all of it just raw material for Jake's intellectual exercises. You know what your problem is, Jake? He looked up from his laptop, eyebrows raised with polite interest. What's that? You think being smart means knowing why everything else is wrong. You think education means being able to tear down what other people have built. I think education means not being afraid to ask difficult questions. No, I said, turning to face him. You think education means having the right to judge everyone around you. You think intelligence gives you permission to treat other people like they're beneath you. Jake closed the laptop slowly, his expression shifting into something I'd never seen before. Not condescension now, not clinical detachment, but something colder and sharper. You're projecting again, Clayton. Just because you feel judged doesn't mean I'm judging you. Aren't you? I'm trying to help you grow. But you're so invested in seeing yourself as a victim that you can't accept constructive criticism. Constructive criticism. A month of systematic humiliation disguised as helpful feedback. Get out, I said. Jake smiled, actually smiled. There it is. The real Clayton. When you can't win an argument with logic, you resort to emotional manipulation. This isn't manipulation. This is me telling you to leave my house. Your house that you can't afford to maintain properly. Your house with outdated electrical systems and inefficient heating. Your house that represents everything that's holding you back from reaching your potential. Everything that's holding you back. My home, my life, my choices, all of it just obstacles to becoming the person Jake thought I should be. Pack your things. Now. Jake stood up, but instead of heading toward his room, he moved closer to me. There was something different about his posture, something more confident and aggressive. You know what I think, Clayton? I don't care what you think. I think you're exactly where you deserve to be. I think this little life you've built, this house, this property, this whole small-town existence, it's perfectly suited to someone of your limitations. Limitations. But he said it differently now, with open contempt instead of clinical observation. I think you've spent your whole life convincing yourself that ignorance is wisdom, that stubbornness is strength, that being unschooled is somehow noble. Unschooled. There was that word again, but now it carried the full weight of his disdain. And the sad part is, you actually believe it. You actually think your little folksy sayings and your grandfather's tools and your quaint religious beliefs make you wise instead of just limited. I felt something snap inside my chest. Not anger anymore, but something colder and more final. The last thin thread of love for this young man finally severing. Get out of my house. I'll leave when I'm ready to leave, Jake said, his voice harder than I'd ever heard it. This has been educational for me too, you know. Watching how people like you think, how you justify your intellectual laziness to yourselves. People like you. Not even pretending now that this was about helping me or caring about my welfare. This was about studying me like some kind of specimen. You're not my grandson anymore, I said quietly. Jake laughed, sharp and ugly. Good. Because you're not much of a grandfather. You're just a sad old man who never learned how to adapt to the modern world. And then he walked out of the room, leaving me standing there with the ruins of everything I'd ever felt for him scattered at my feet. But he still didn't leave. That was Tuesday. By Thursday, I realized he never intended to leave. This was his home now, according to some twisted logic that made sense only to him. He claimed it, the way he'd claimed the right to judge and analyze and dismiss everything about my life. And that's when I started planning. Not revenge, not yet. Just something to remind him that actions have consequences. Something to show him that treating people like garbage might not be as safe as he thought it was. I knew these woods, these creeks, these roads like they were part of my own body. I'd been walking this land for 7 decades, knew every hidden path and dangerous turn. Jake, for all his education and superior intelligence, was still a city boy who got lost trying to find the mailbox. The idea came to me on Friday morning when I was working near the old creek that runs along the back of my property. There's a spot where the bank is steep and the water runs deep and fast, especially after the fall rains we've been having. And there's a footbridge I'd built myself 20 years ago, solid construction, but narrow. Narrow enough that if someone were to slip, or get bumped, or lose their balance. I told myself I just wanted to scare him. Give him a taste of what it felt like to be helpless, to be at someone else's mercy. Maybe a little cold water would wash some of that smug superiority out of his system. But even as I was thinking it, I knew it was more than that. I knew I wanted to hurt him the way he'd been hurting me. I wanted him to feel small and frightened and powerless. I wanted him to know what it was like to be unschooled. The next morning, Saturday, I made my move. Jake was in his room as usual, probably working on another analysis of everything wrong with my life, when I knocked on his door. Jake? I was thinking about what you said the other day. About examining my beliefs, questioning my assumptions. I heard movement inside, then the door opened. Jake looked surprised but pleased, like he'd been waiting for me to admit he was right all along. Oh? There's something I want to show you. Something that might help you understand why this place means so much to me. His eyes lit up with that familiar hunger for another opportunity to educate me. What is it? Down by the creek. There's a spot where my grandfather used to take me when I was a boy. Where he taught me about the land, about our family history. I think maybe you're right. Maybe I need to look at it with fresh eyes. Jake smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in weeks. Not condescending, not clinical, just pleased that I was finally ready to accept his guidance. That sounds great, Clayton. I'd love to help you work through whatever insights come up. Help me work through insights. Even my potential emotional breakthrough was just another opportunity for him to demonstrate his superiority. We walked through the woods toward the creek, Jake chattering about the psychological benefits of connecting with nature and examining family narratives. I nodded and made appropriate responses, leading him deeper into the woods, farther from the house, farther from help. When we reached the footbridge, Jake stopped talking for a moment, looking out over the fast-moving water with something approaching appreciation. It's actually quite beautiful, he said. I can see why this place would have sentimental value. Sentimental value. Even the beauty of the land I'd loved all my life was reduced to psychological attachment in his worldview. My grandfather stood right here, I said, moving onto the bridge. Told me about the responsibility that comes with owning land, about taking care of something bigger than yourself. Jake followed me onto the narrow wooden planks, still talking about the anthropological significance of place-based identity formation. We were halfway across when I stopped and turned to face him. You know what he told me that day, Jake? What's that? He said that a man's character isn't measured by how much he knows, but by how he treats the people who depend on him. Jake's expression shifted slightly, some instinct warning him that something had changed in my tone. That's a nice sentiment, Clayton, but... I stepped closer to him on the narrow bridge. He also told me that when someone shows you who they really are, you should believe them the first time. I'm not sure what you're getting at. I'm getting at the fact that you've shown me exactly who you are, Jake. You're someone who takes pleasure in making other people feel small. Someone who thinks cruelty is justified as long as you call it education. Jake's eyes narrowed, his body tensing. Clayton, I think you're misinterpreting. No, I said, taking another step forward. I think I'm finally seeing clearly. You want to know what my grandfather would have said about someone like you? What? I smiled, feeling a cold satisfaction I hadn't experienced in weeks. He would have said that some lessons can only be learned the hard way. And then I pushed him. The look of shock on Jake's face as he fell backward into that cold, fast-moving creek, that's an image that'll stay with me until the day I die. Not because I regret it, mind you, but because it was the first time in a month that I'd seen him look genuinely surprised by something he couldn't control or analyze or explain away. The splash was bigger than I'd expected. Jake hit the water hard, went under for a few seconds that stretched out like hours, then came up sputtering and gasping about 20 feet downstream. The current was stronger than it looked from the bridge, fed by all that October rain we'd been having. But he was a good swimmer, I'll give him that. Whatever else those fancy schools had taught him, they'd managed to keep him alive in the water. He fought his way to the surface, treading water, looking up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. Help me, he called out, his voice higher than I'd ever heard it. Clayton, help me! Clayton. Not grandfather, not even the formal version he'd been using. Just my name, shouted with the kind of desperation that comes when all your intellectual superiority runs headfirst into cold, physical reality. I stood on that bridge, looking down at my grandson struggling in the water, and felt something I hadn't expected, satisfaction. Deep, warm satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with seeing him finally understand what it felt like to be powerless. Please! He shouted again, the current pulling him farther downstream. I can't, the current's too strong! And that's when I heard it. That sound that changed everything. Jake wasn't just calling for help, he was laughing. Even as he struggled against the current, even as genuine fear filled his eyes, he was laughing. "You actually did it!" he called out, his voice carrying a note of amazement mixed with that horrible laughter. "You actually pushed me in." I felt my blood chill. This wasn't the reaction I'd expected. Fear, yes. Panic, maybe. But not laughter. Not that same condescending amusement I'd been hearing for a month. "This is perfect," Jake continued, managing to grab hold of a fallen log that was jutting out into the creek. "This is exactly what I would have predicted from someone so unschooled." Unschooled. Even drowning in a creek, even fighting for his life, he couldn't resist that word. Couldn't resist one final demonstration of his intellectual superiority. "You think this proves something, don't you?" he shouted over the sound of rushing water. "You think this makes you strong?" I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. This wasn't going the way I'd imagined. Jake wasn't humbled or frightened or finally understanding what it felt like to be helpless. He was analyzing the situation, finding ways to feel superior even while treading water. "This is just violence, Clayton. Crude, primitive violence from someone who can't win an argument with logic." Logic. Even here, even now, everything came back to logic and intelligence and education. "It's actually quite sad," he continued, his grip on the log starting to slip. "A 73-year-old man resorting to physical assault because he can't handle being challenged intellectually." I stared down at him, this young man who was my own blood, who I'd loved since the day he was born, and realized I didn't know him at all. The Jake I remembered, the boy who used to help me feed the chickens and listen to my stories, that person was gone, if he'd ever really existed. This wasn't my grandson anymore. This was someone who saw me as nothing more than a fascinating example of rural ignorance, someone whose attempted murder was just more evidence for his theories about intellectual inferiority. "You know what the really pathetic part is?" Jake called out, his voice getting weaker as the cold water sapped his strength. "You probably think this makes us even. Like physical violence is somehow equivalent to intellectual discourse." Intellectual discourse. A month of systematic humiliation rebranded as academic discussion. "But it doesn't make us even, Clayton. It just proves everything I've been saying about people like you." People like you. Even facing death, he couldn't stop categorizing and dismissing everyone who wasn't him. And that's when I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Jake wasn't struggling because he was afraid of drowning. He was struggling because he genuinely believed he was too important, too intelligent, too valuable to die in some backwoods creek at the hands of his ignorant grandfather. He thought his education, his superior mind, his ability to analyze and criticize, he thought all of that made him invulnerable to the basic realities of physics and cold water and human mortality. "Help me up," he demanded, his voice carrying that same expectant tone he'd been using all month. "This has gone far enough. This has gone far enough." Like he was still in control, still making the rules, still entitled to have his demands met by someone he considered intellectually inferior. I stood there on that bridge, looking down at this stranger wearing my grandson's face, and felt something final settle in my chest. Not anger anymore, not even satisfaction. Just a cold, clear understanding of what had to happen next. "You know what, Jake?" I called down to him. "What?" he gasped, his grip on the log slipping again. "I think you're right. I am unschooled." His eyes widened slightly, maybe recognizing something different in my tone. "I never learned how to use big words to make other people feel small. I never figured out how to disguise cruelty as education. I never mastered the art of tearing people down and calling it constructive criticism." Jake's mouth opened as if to respond, but I kept talking. "And you know what else I never learned? I never learned how to swim in creek water when it's 38 degrees and moving fast enough to pull you under." The color drained from his face as the full implications of what I was saying finally hit him. "But here's the thing about being unschooled, Jake, it means I learned other things instead. Things like how this creek behaves in different weather. How long someone can survive in water this cold. How far downstream a body travels before it gets caught on something. Clayton. His voice was different now. Smaller. More afraid. I also learned things like patience. How to wait for the right moment. How to make sure there are no witnesses around when you need to handle a problem. Jake's grip on the log was failing. The current was pulling at him, and his hands were too cold to maintain their hold. Please, he whispered, and for the first time in a month, there was no condescension in his voice. Just pure, desperate need. Please what, Jake? Please help me. I looked down at him, this young man who'd spent weeks systematically destroying every ounce of respect and affection I'd ever felt for him, and felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no regret. Just empty, cold nothing. You know what your problem is? I said, echoing the phrase he'd used on me so many times. He stared up at me, water lapping at his chin as his strength failed. You think being smart makes you better than everyone else. You think education gives you the right to judge and dismiss and tear down anyone who doesn't meet your standards. Jake tried to speak, but the cold was making his jaw chatter too hard to form words. But here's what your fancy schools never taught you, grandson. Intelligence without wisdom is just arrogance. Knowledge without compassion is just cruelty. And all the education in the world doesn't mean a damn thing if you haven't learned how to be a decent human being. His grip failed completely. Jake slipped off the log, went under, came back up 20 feet downstream. The current was carrying him toward a section where the creek narrowed and picked up speed, where fallen trees created a maze of obstacles that could trap someone who didn't know how to navigate them. Clayton! He screamed, all pretense of superiority finally stripped away. Help me! I'm sorry! I'm sorry! I'm sorry. 2 words that might have changed everything if he'd learned to say them a month ago. 2 words that meant nothing now, when they were motivated by fear instead of genuine remorse. I walked along the bridge, keeping pace with his progress downstream, watching him fight against the current that was pulling him toward deeper, faster water. You want to know what I think, Jake? I called out. He looked up at me with pure terror in his eyes, no longer able to speak coherently. I think this is the first real education you've ever gotten. The first time you've learned something that can't be found in books or downloaded from the internet. Jake disappeared around a bend in the creek, his cries for help growing fainter as the water carried him away from me. I stood on that bridge for a long time after his voice faded completely, listening to the sound of fast-moving water and feeling absolutely nothing at all. Then I walked home, made myself a cup of coffee, and called the sheriff's department to report that my grandson had fallen into the creek and been swept away by the current. If you've ever had someone in your life who made you feel worthless, who systematically tore down everything you were and called it help, then you understand what I felt in that moment. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just the quiet peace that comes when a source of constant pain finally stops. But Jake's story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The sheriff's department arrived within 20 minutes of my call. Deputy Martinez, a young woman I'd known since she was in high school, pulled up in her patrol car followed by the volunteer fire department's rescue truck and about half the town, it seemed like. Word travels fast in a place like ours. When someone falls into Miller's Creek during high water season, everybody knows it's serious business. Clayton, Deputy Martinez said as she got out of her car. Tell me what happened. I was sitting on my front porch when she arrived, still wearing the same clothes I'd had on when I pushed Jake into the water. I'd considered changing, maybe trying to manufacture some evidence that I'd attempted a rescue, but decided that would just complicate things. Better to stick as close to the truth as possible. That's what my father always told me, the best lies are mostly true. Jake wanted me to show him something down by the creek, I said, standing up slowly like the old man I was. That footbridge I built back in the 90s, you remember it? Sure do. You and my dad worked on that thing together. That's right. Well, we were walking across it, and Jake was looking around, not paying attention to his footing. Bridge is narrow, you know, and those boards can be slippery when they're wet from the morning dew. Deputy Martinez was writing in her notepad, but I could see her watching my face carefully. What happened then? He slipped. Just lost his balance and went backward into the water. Happened so fast I couldn't grab him. Did you try to help him? This was the crucial moment. The point where I had to decide how much of a hero to make myself out to be. Course I did. Soon as he hit the water, I was yelling for him to grab onto something. But that current's strong after all this rain we've had. Swept him downstream before I could do much of anything. Did you go in after him? I gestured at my 73-year-old body, at the cane I'd started using more regularly in recent years. Deputy, I'm not the swimmer I used to be. Figured I'd just make things worse, maybe drown myself trying to save him. She nodded, making more notes. So what did you do? Followed along the bank as far as I could, calling out to him. But the creek bends around those big rocks about a quarter-mile downstream, and I lost sight of him. That's when I came back to call you folks. It was a good story. Simple, believable, and possible to disprove. The kind of story a frightened old man would tell about a tragic accident. But I could see something in Deputy Martinez's eyes that made me think she wasn't entirely convinced. Clayton, I have to ask, how were you and Jake getting along? I know it can be difficult when family members come to stay. Now this was interesting. Someone had been talking, spreading word around town about the tension between me and my grandson. In a place this small, people noticed things, remembered conversations, picked up on details that might seem insignificant to outsiders. We had our differences, I admitted. Boy's got a lot of education, sometimes made him think he knew better than folks who've been around longer. But he's still family. Still my grandson. Any arguments recently? Anything that might have made him upset or distracted? I considered lying, denying any problems between us. But too many people had probably seen or heard evidence of our conflicts. Better to acknowledge what was already known and control the narrative around it. We had words yesterday about him needing to head back to his mother's place. Jake's been here over a month, and I thought it was time for him to figure out his next move. He wasn't happy about it, but nothing serious. Just family stuff. Deputy Martinez wrote for another minute, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. All right, Clayton. We'll start searching downstream from the bridge. Could you show us exactly where it happened? The search went on for 3 days. Volunteers from town, search and rescue teams from the county, even some folks with boats who came up from the river where Miller's Creek eventually emptied out. They brought dogs, helicopters, equipment I'd never seen before. I played the part of the worried grandfather perfectly. Helped coordinate the search effort from my kitchen, provided coffee and food for the volunteers, answered questions from investigators with just the right mix of cooperation and grief. And through it all, I felt nothing. No guilt, no regret, no second thoughts about what I'd done. If anything, watching all those people spend their time and energy looking for Jake just reinforced my conviction that I'd made the right choice. This community, these decent, hard-working people who'd known me for decades, they were out there risking their own safety to find someone who'd spent a month treating their neighbor like garbage. They didn't know what Jake really was, what he'd become. They just saw a young man in trouble and responded with the kind of basic human decency Jake had never learned to appreciate. On the second day of the search, my daughter Sarah arrived from 2 states away. I heard her car in the driveway around noon and went out to meet her, preparing myself for what might be the most difficult conversation of my life. She looked terrible. Dark circles under her eyes, hair uncombed, wearing clothes she'd obviously thrown on without thinking. The face of a mother whose child was missing, possibly dead. "Dad," she said, and collapsed into my arms. I held her while she cried, feeling the weight of her grief and knowing I was responsible for it. This was the one part of my plan I hadn't fully considered, what it would do to Sarah to lose her son, even a son who'd turned into someone unrecognizable. "Tell me what happened," she said when she finally stopped crying. So I told her the same story I'd told Deputy Martinez and everyone else. The same simple, tragic accident that explained everything and revealed nothing. Sarah listened without interrupting, but I could see questions forming in her eyes. "Dad, I need to know, were you two fighting about something?" Jake called me last week, said you'd asked him to leave. Here it was. The moment when I'd have to decide how much truth to tell my own daughter. We weren't fighting exactly. But Jake. Sarah, he wasn't the same boy who used to visit us. Something had changed in him. What do you mean? I chose my words carefully. He spent a lot of time telling me everything that was wrong with my life. The way I thought, the choices I'd made, the things I believed. Said he was trying to help me, but it felt more like he was trying to tear me down. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. He's been like that since college. Always analyzing everyone, always having opinions about how other people should live. It got worse after he lost his job. Like he needed to prove he was still smarter than everyone else by pointing out their mistakes. I know. I was hoping that spending time here, being away from all that pressure, I thought maybe it would help him remember who he used to be. Who he used to be. But that was the problem, wasn't it? Maybe Jake hadn't changed at all. Maybe the cruel, condescending young man I'd pushed into the creek was who he'd always been, and the sweet boy I remembered was just a mask he'd worn when it suited him. I'm sorry, Dad. I should have warned you about how he'd been acting. I should have prepared you for what he'd become. What he'd become. Sarah knew. She'd known when she asked me to take him and that Jake had turned into someone difficult to love. She'd sent him to me anyway, maybe hoping I could fix whatever was broken in him. But some things can't be fixed. Some people choose to be cruel, choose to take pleasure in making others feel small. And sometimes the only way to stop them is to make sure they can't hurt anyone else. It's not your fault, sweetheart. Jake made his own choices. The search continued for another day, then was officially called off when the dogs lost the scent trail about 2 miles downstream where the creek joined up with Miller's River. The assumption was that Jake's body had been swept into the main river and would probably turn up eventually, maybe miles away, maybe not at all. The official cause of death would be listed as accidental drowning. Case closed. After everyone left, after the volunteers went home and the equipment was packed away and my property was quiet again, I walked down to that footbridge where it all started. The wood was still damp from all the searchers who'd tramped across it over the past 3 days. I could see where they'd marked measurements, taken photographs, analyzed the scene for any clues about what had happened. But they hadn't found any evidence of foul play because there wasn't any evidence to find. Just a narrow bridge, slippery wood, and fast-moving water below. The kind of accident that could happen to anyone who wasn't paying attention to where they stepped. I stood there for a long time, remembering the look on Jake's face when he realized I wasn't going to help him. The way his intellectual superiority had finally crumbled when confronted with cold water and basic physics. And I felt satisfied. Not happy, exactly, but satisfied in the way you feel when you've completed a difficult but necessary job. The world was a slightly better place without Jake in it. That might sound harsh, but it was true. He'd been a source of pain and humiliation for everyone around him, someone who took pleasure in making others feel inferior. Now he was gone, and the people who'd known him could remember the boy he used to be instead of the cruel young man he'd become. But as I turned to walk back to the house, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Applause. Slow, deliberate applause coming from the woods behind me. I spun around, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, but saw nothing. Just trees and shadows and the sound of water running over rocks. "Hello?" I called out. "Someone there?" No answer. Just the normal sounds of the forest and my own heart hammering in my chest. I told myself I was imagining things. The stress of the past few days, the guilt I didn't want to admit I was feeling, the fear of being caught, all of it was making me hear things that weren't there. But as I walked back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. Someone who knew exactly what had happened on that bridge. Someone who approved. 3 weeks after Jake's body was supposed to have been swept away by the current, 3 weeks after I'd watched the entire town search for a young man I'd murdered, I was sitting on my front porch enjoying the first truly peaceful evening I'd had in months. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the smell of wood smoke from chimneys around the valley. I had a cup of coffee cooling beside my chair and a book I'd been meaning to read for years finally open in my lap. For the first time since Jake arrived, I felt like I could breathe in my own home. That's when I saw headlights coming up my long gravel driveway. At first I thought it might be Deputy Martinez with follow-up questions, or maybe Sarah coming back to collect Jake's belongings. But as the car got closer, I could see it was that same black German sedan Jake had arrived in 6 weeks ago. My blood turned to ice water. The car pulled up in front of the house and sat there idling for a moment, headlights pointed directly at me. I couldn't see through the windshield because of the glare, but I knew who was behind the wheel. Somehow, impossibly, Jake had survived. The engine shut off, the headlights died, and the driver's door opened. Jake stepped out slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. He looked different. Thinner, paler, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard experiences. His expensive clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a worn flannel shirt that looked like they'd come from a thrift store. But his eyes were exactly the same. That cold, calculating intelligence that saw everything and judged everyone. "Hello, Clayton," he said, his voice carrying easily across the evening air. I set my coffee cup down with hands that were trying hard not to shake. "Jake, you're alive? Disappointed?" The question hung between us like a challenge. I could lie, act surprised and relieved, play the role of the grandfather who'd mourned his missing grandson. But something in Jake's expression told me there was no point in pretense. "Where have you been?" I asked instead. Jake walked closer, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "Learning. Growing. Examining some assumptions I'd never questioned before." The same clinical language he'd always used, but with an edge I'd never heard before. Something harder and more focused. "The whole town's been looking for you." "I know. I've been watching from the woods. Very touching, seeing how much everyone cared about finding me." Watching from the woods. That explained the applause I'd heard by the creek. Jake had been out there the whole time, hidden, observing, planning whatever this was. "Your mother's been worried sick. My mother sent me here to be fixed by someone she thought could handle me. Well, mission accomplished. I've definitely been educated." I felt cold sweat forming on my forehead despite the evening chill. "Jake, I don't know what you think. I think you pushed me into that creek intending for me to drown," he said, his voice perfectly calm and conversational. "I think you got tired of having your ignorance challenged and decided to solve the problem with violence." There it was. Out in the open, impossible to deny or deflect. "I think you've spent the past 3 weeks congratulating yourself on committing the perfect murder, feeling satisfied that you'd rid the world of someone who made you uncomfortable." I opened my mouth to respond, but Jake held up a hand. "Don't. Please don't insult my intelligence by denying it. We both know what happened on that bridge." He was right. There was no point in lying anymore, no benefit to maintaining the fiction that it had been an accident. "So what now?" I asked. Jake smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen on a human face. Not angry, not cruel, just satisfied. Like a chess player who just realized he was 3 moves away from checkmate. "Now we have a conversation about education. About what it really means to learn from experience." He climbed the porch steps slowly, settling into the chair across from mine like he was visiting an old friend. "You know what I discovered during my time in the woods, Clayton?" "What's that?" "I discovered that you were right about some things. Book learning isn't the same as experience. Intellectual analysis isn't the same as practical knowledge. And sometimes, the most important lessons can't be found in any classroom." This wasn't what I'd expected. No accusations, no threats, no demands for justice. Just Jake talking in that same measured, thoughtful tone he'd always used. "What did you learn?" I asked carefully. "I learned what it feels like to be powerless. To be at someone else's mercy, dependent on their goodwill for survival." Jake's voice was soft, almost meditative. "Do you know what that's like, Clayton? Really knowing that your life depends entirely on someone else's choice?" I didn't answer, but Jake didn't seem to expect me to. When I went under in that creek, when the current grabbed me and pulled me downstream, I had about 30 seconds of pure, absolute terror. Not intellectual fear, the kind you can analyze and rationalize, but primal, animal panic. He paused, staring out at the darkness beyond the porch light. I thought I was going to die. And in those 30 seconds, all my education, all my intelligence, all my superior knowledge, none of it mattered. I was just another frightened animal fighting for survival. But you didn't die. No. I managed to grab onto a root system about half a mile downstream, pulled myself out of the water. Hypothermic, exhausted, but alive. Jake turned to look at me directly. And you know what my first thought was? I waited. Gratitude. Pure, overwhelming gratitude to be alive. Even though I knew, absolutely knew, that you tried to murder me, I was grateful. This was not going the way I'd expected. Where was the anger? The threats? The demands for justice? I sat there by that creek, shivering and half-drowned, and I realized something profound. For the first time in my adult life, I'd experienced something that couldn't be reduced to theory or analysis. I'd touched something real and immediate and completely beyond my control. Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, setting it on the table between us. Which brings us to why I'm here. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Jake. Oh, don't worry. I'm not recording this conversation. In fact, I'm not planning to tell anyone what really happened on that bridge. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You're not? No. Because that would be unimaginative. Crude. The kind of simple-minded response you'd expect from someone who thinks in terms of basic concepts like justice and punishment. He picked up the recorder, turned it over in his hands like he was examining a fascinating artifact. You see, Clayton, you taught me something important that day. You showed me that there are forms of education that can't be found in books. Lessons that can only be learned through direct, visceral experience. I don't understand. I think you do. You demonstrated that when someone becomes unbearable, when they systematically degrade and humiliate the people around them, sometimes the only solution is to remove them from the equation entirely. Jake's smile grew wider, more genuine. It was brilliant, really. Simple, direct, impossible to trace back to you. The perfect crime disguised as a tragic accident. Jake, what do you want? I want to thank you. You gave me the most valuable education I've ever received. You showed me what real power looks like. Real power. The way he said those words made my skin crawl. You see, all my life I thought power came from intelligence, from being smarter than everyone around me, from having the right answers and the superior knowledge. But that's not power at all, that's just intellectual masturbation. Jake stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, looked out over the land that had been in my family for 3 generations. Real power is the ability to make people disappear when they become inconvenient. Real power is being able to destroy someone's life while maintaining complete deniability. Real power is understanding that morality is just a luxury for people who don't have the courage to take what they want. I felt something cold and terrible settling in my stomach. What are you saying? I'm saying that you've inspired me, Clayton. You've shown me a new way of looking at the world, a more practical approach to problem solving. Jake turned back to face me, and his expression was completely calm, completely reasonable, completely terrifying. I've been thinking about this for 3 weeks now, trying to understand the deeper implications of what you did. And I've come to some interesting conclusions. Like what? Like the fact that you didn't just try to kill me because you were angry or hurt. You tried to kill me because I represented a threat to your comfortable illusions about yourself and your world. Jake sat back down, leaning forward with the intense focus he'd once reserved for explaining my intellectual shortcomings. You couldn't handle having your assumptions challenged, your limitations exposed, your ignorance illuminated. So you decided that the problem wasn't your own inability to grow, the problem was me. That's not. Please. Let me finish. This is important. He waited until I nodded, then continued. What you did was essentially what every tyrant, every authoritarian, every small-minded dictator throughout history has done when confronted with uncomfortable truths. You tried to eliminate the messenger rather than deal with the message. Jake's voice was getting more animated now, like he was working through a complex theoretical problem. It's actually quite fascinating from a psychological perspective. Rather than engage in genuine self-reflection, rather than consider that maybe, just maybe, some of my criticisms had merit, you chose violence. You weren't offering criticism, Jake. You were being cruel. Was I? Or was I just refusing to enable your delusions about yourself? The question hung in the air between us. I wanted to argue with him, to defend myself, but something in his tone made me hesitate. Think about it objectively, Clayton. I spent weeks trying to help you see beyond your limited perspective. I offered you research, data, alternative ways of thinking about problems. I challenged you to grow as a person. You made me feel like garbage in my own home. I made you feel uncomfortable. There's a difference. Jake leaned back in his chair, studying me with that same clinical interest he'd shown everything else. But here's what I've realized during my time in the woods. You were never really angry about being challenged intellectually. You were angry about being challenged at all. What does that mean? It means that you've spent your entire life surrounded by people who treat you like you're wise and experienced and worthy of respect, even though you've never actually earned that respect through genuine achievement or growth. I felt my anger starting to build, but Jake held up a hand. Think about it. Your friends, your neighbors, your community, they all defer to you because you're older, because you've been here longer, because you represent some nostalgic idea of traditional values and folksy wisdom. There's nothing wrong with respecting your elders. There is when that respect is based on age rather than merit. There is when it shields you from ever having to confront your own limitations or question your own assumptions. Jake stood up again, started pacing across the porch. You know what you really are, Clayton? You're intellectually lazy. You've spent 73 years avoiding any situation that might force you to acknowledge how much you don't know, how limited your understanding really is. And you know what you are, Jake? You're a cruel, arrogant child who thinks intelligence gives you the right to hurt people. Maybe. But at least I'm not a coward. The word hit like a physical blow. Coward? Yes. A coward. Someone so afraid of intellectual discomfort that he resorts to attempted murder rather than face the possibility that he might be wrong about something. Jake stopped pacing, turned to look at me directly. But here's the beautiful irony of the situation. By trying to kill me, you actually validated everything I'd been saying about you. How do you figure? You proved that when push comes to shove, you're exactly the kind of person who chooses violence over growth, who eliminates problems rather than solving them, who clings to ignorance because knowledge is too frightening to contemplate. I stared at this young man, my grandson, my own blood, and realized that surviving his attempted murder hadn't humbled him, or changed him, or taught him anything about humility. If anything, it had made him worse. So what happens now? I asked. Jake smiled that terrible, satisfied smile again. Now we begin your real education. Jake reached into his other jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder, thick with papers and photographs. He set it on the table between us with the same deliberate care he'd shown the recorder. Open it, he said. I didn't want to touch whatever was in that folder, but something in Jake's tone made it clear I didn't have a choice. With hands that were definitely shaking now, I opened the cover. The first thing I saw was a photograph of myself standing on the footbridge, looking down at the water. It was taken from the woods, probably with a telephoto lens, and showed me clearly in the act of, what? Thinking? Planning? The image was damning without being definitive. Keep looking, Jake said softly. The next page was a detailed timeline of the morning Jake disappeared. Every movement I'd made, every word I'd spoken, documented with the precision of a criminal investigation. Someone had been watching me very carefully, taking notes, building a case. How did you? I told you. I've been in the woods for 3 weeks. Turns out there's quite a lot you can see from the right vantage point, if you're patient and you know what to look for. I flipped through more pages. Photos of me talking to Deputy Martinez, photos of me helping coordinate the search effort, photos of me comforting Sarah when she arrived. All of it documented, all of it evidence of my deception. But it was the last section that made my blood run cold. Bank records. Financial statements. Insurance policies. My entire financial life laid out in spreadsheets and charts with the kind of meticulous analysis Jake had once applied to my garden and my filing system. "You've been busy," I said quietly. "Very busy. Did you know that your life insurance policy pays double for accidental death? Interesting coincidence, considering how quickly you had me declared dead." "I didn't declare you dead. The sheriff's department. The sheriff's department followed your lead. They took your story at face value because you're a respected member of the community with no apparent motive for harming your own grandson." Jake reached across the table, flipped to a page showing my recent financial transactions. "But look at this. 3 days after my accidental death, you made a significant payment toward your property taxes. A week later, you scheduled that roof repair you've been putting off for 2 years. Yesterday, you put money down on a new truck." I stared at the records, seeing my own choices reflected back at me through Jake's analytical lens. It did look suspicious when laid out like this, like I'd been planning to benefit from his death. "That's not why I did it," I said. "Isn't it? Are you sure about that, Clayton?" The question was posed with Jake's familiar intellectual curiosity, but underneath it I could hear something else. A trap being set, a test being administered. "You're damn right I'm sure. I didn't kill you for money. Then why did you kill me?" "Kill. Not try to kill. Or attempt to murder. Kill." Like it was an established fact that needed no qualification. "You know why." "I know what you told yourself. But I'm asking what you really think, deep down, was motivating your actions." I closed the folder, pushed it back toward him. "I think you made me feel like nothing. I think you spent a month systematically destroying every ounce of self-respect I had, and I snapped." "Interesting. So you're saying I deserved to die because I hurt your feelings?" "I'm saying you deserved consequences for the way you treated people." Jake nodded thoughtfully, like he was considering my answer. "And you appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner?" "Someone had to. Someone had to." "That's fascinating, Clayton. Tell me more about that." This felt like another one of his psychological evaluations, another opportunity for him to analyze and dissect my motivations. But I was tired of being defensive, tired of justifying myself to someone who'd shown me nothing but contempt. "You want to know the truth, Jake? Fine. You were a poison. You were toxic and cruel, and you took pleasure in making other people feel small. The world is better off without people like you in it. People like me. Yes. People who think intelligence gives them the right to be cruel. People who confuse education with wisdom, knowledge with character. And you think that justified killing me? I think it justified stopping you." Jake leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "So you see yourself as what? Some kind of defender of the innocent? A vigilante protecting simple folk from the cruel intellectuals?" When he put it like that, it sounded ridiculous. But there was truth in it too, truth I was surprised to find myself willing to acknowledge. Maybe there are people in this world who need protecting from people like you. People like you, people like me. You're very fond of categories, aren't you, Clayton? Aren't you? You spent a month putting me in categories. Unschooled. Limited. Intellectually lazy. Touché. But there's a difference between analysis and murder. Jake stood up, walked to the porch railing, looked out over the property that had been in my family for 3 generations. "You know what I think really happened that morning on the bridge?" "What's that?" "I think you realized that everything I'd been saying about you was true. You are intellectually limited. You are resistant to growth. You do use tradition and sentiment to avoid confronting uncomfortable realities about yourself." I felt my anger flaring again, but Jake continued before I could respond. And instead of dealing with those truths, instead of using them as motivation for genuine self-improvement, you decided that the problem wasn't your own limitations. The problem was me pointing them out. So you tried to kill the messenger rather than deal with the message. Classic displacement behavior. Displacement behavior. Even my attempted murder was just another psychological concept to be categorized and explained. But here's what you didn't consider, Jake said, turning back to face me. What if I was wrong about some things? What if my analysis of your character was incomplete or biased by my own intellectual arrogance? This was unexpected. Jake admitting he might have been wrong about something? What if the real problem wasn't your ignorance or your limitations, but my inability to see past them to whatever genuine wisdom and experience you actually possess? I stared at him, trying to figure out where this was leading. You see, Clayton, during my time in the woods, I had opportunity to really think about our interactions. To examine them from different perspectives, to consider alternative interpretations of what was happening between us. Jake sat back down, leaned forward with that intense focus I knew so well. And I came to some interesting conclusions about both of us. Like what? Like the fact that you were absolutely right about one thing: I was being cruel. Not educational, not helpful, cruel. I was using my intelligence as a weapon to hurt someone who'd opened his home to me. This admission should have felt like vindication, but something in Jake's tone made me wary. Why? Why was I cruel? That's the interesting question, isn't it? What was I really trying to accomplish? Jake paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. I think I was trying to make you small because I felt small myself. I lost my job, I was living with my grandfather because I had nowhere else to go, and my whole identity as this brilliant young professional had collapsed. So you took it out on me. I took it out on you. And more than that, I convinced myself that I was helping you, that my cruelty was actually a form of education. Classic rationalization. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and wariness. Jake was finally acknowledging what he'd put me through, finally admitting that his behavior had been wrong. But there was something in his expression that suggested this wasn't leading where I thought it was. So what are you saying, Jake? I'm saying that we both made mistakes. I was cruel and you were violent. I used psychology as a weapon and you used physics as a weapon. We're both guilty of trying to hurt each other. But only one of us actually tried to commit murder. Jake smiled that terrible smile again. Did I? The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp but unmistakably present. What do you mean? Think about it, Clayton. I spent a month systematically destroying your self-respect, your sense of worth, your psychological well-being. I attacked everything you valued, everything you believed in, everything that gave your life meaning. Jake's voice was getting softer, more thoughtful. What do you call it when someone deliberately sets out to destroy another person's will to live, their sense of self-worth, their basic human dignity? I felt cold understanding beginning to dawn. Psychological murder, Jake continued. Death by 1,000 cuts. The systematic destruction of someone's spirit until there's nothing left but an empty shell. That's not the same thing as. Isn't it? You tried to kill my body. I tried to kill your soul. Which one of us was being more cruel? I stared at this young man, my grandson, and realized that surviving his attempted murder hadn't taught him humility or compassion. It had taught him something far more dangerous. It had taught him that he was capable of inspiring someone to murder. And he liked it. Jake opened the folder again, flipped to a section I hadn't seen before. More photographs, but these were different. Older. Some of them looked like they'd been taken with a phone camera, others were printed from social media. Let me tell you a story, Clayton. A story about a young man who graduated from college with honors, landed a prestigious job at a consulting firm, and seemed to have the world at his feet. He slid a photograph across the table. Jake in a suit, standing in what looked like a corporate office, smiling confidently at the camera. This young man was brilliant, articulate, full of ideas about how to make the world more efficient and rational. His colleagues respected his analytical abilities, his supervisors praised his attention to detail, Another photo. Jake at what looked like a company party, surrounded by other young professionals, everyone looking successful and happy. But there was a problem. This young man had a flaw that his education had never addressed, a blind spot that his intelligence couldn't compensate for. What kind of flaw? He didn't understand people. Not really. He could analyze behavior, predict responses, manipulate outcomes, but he couldn't connect with people on a genuine human level. Jake's voice was matter-of-fact, clinical in the way it had always been when he was explaining my shortcomings. He saw every interaction as a problem to be solved, every relationship as a system to be optimized. He treated colleagues like variables in an equation, clients like data points to be managed. More photos. Jake at meetings, Jake giving presentations, Jake looking increasingly isolated despite being surrounded by people. And slowly, inevitably, people began to avoid him. Not because he wasn't competent, he was extremely competent. But because being around him was exhausting, demoralizing. He had a way of making people feel stupid and inadequate without even realizing he was doing it. I looked at the photographs, seeing a progression I hadn't noticed before. In the early images, Jake looked confident and engaged. But as I flipped through them, I could see something changing in his expression. A growing isolation, a defensive hardness around his eyes. His supervisor called it interpersonal challenges. His colleagues called it poor emotional intelligence. But what it really was an inability to see other people as anything more than inferior versions of himself. So they fired you. They transferred me to a different department. Then to a different project. Then to increasingly marginal roles until it became clear that they were just waiting for me to quit. Jake pulled out another document, what looked like a performance evaluation. Jake demonstrates exceptional analytical abilities and technical competence, he read aloud. However, his communication style has been described by team members as condescending and dismissive. Multiple colleagues have reported feeling undermined and devalued after interactions with Jake. He set the evaluation on the table between us. Recommendation: Jake would benefit from coaching on emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills. Without improvement in these areas, his long-term success with the company is uncertain. I studied the document, seeing my grandson's professional failure laid out in corporate language. They tried to help you. They tried to change me. There's a difference. Is there? Jake's expression hardened slightly. They wanted me to pretend that everyone's opinions were equally valid, that intelligence and ignorance deserved equal respect, that being right was less important than making people feel good about being wrong. Maybe they just wanted you to treat people with basic human decency. Maybe. Or maybe they wanted me to enable mediocrity by pretending it was acceptable. I heard the echo of our old arguments in his words, the same justifications he'd used for his cruelty toward me. So you lost your job because you couldn't stop making people feel small. I lost my job because I refused to participate in the collective delusion that everyone's perspective has value. Jake stood up, started pacing again. But here's what I learned during my time in the woods, Clayton. Here's the real education you gave me. What's that? I learned that I was wrong. Not about intelligence or knowledge or the value of education. I was wrong about people. He stopped pacing, looked directly at me. I thought people like you, working class, limited education, traditional values, I thought you were intellectually inferior and that was the end of the story. Simple people leading simple lives, unaware of how much you didn't know. And now? Now I understand that intelligence comes in different forms. That there are kinds of knowledge that can't be measured by standardized tests or academic achievement. This sounded almost like an apology, but something in Jake's tone made me suspicious. What kind of knowledge? The knowledge of how to destroy someone psychologically. The knowledge of exactly what words to use to break down another person's self-worth. The knowledge of how to disguise cruelty as helpfulness. My blood went cold. You see, Clayton, I spent weeks trying to educate you, trying to show you the limitations of your worldview. But I was approaching it all wrong. Jake sat back down, leaned forward with that intense focus. I was trying to make you smarter, when what I should have been doing was making you understand how stupid you really are. I was trying to expand your knowledge, when what I should have been doing was showing you how little you actually know. What are you saying? I'm saying that you taught me something invaluable about the application of intelligence. You showed me that knowledge isn't just about having information, it's about knowing how to use that information to achieve specific outcomes. Jake's smile was growing wider, more genuine. And the outcome I wanted, the outcome I should have been working toward from the beginning, wasn't making you better. It was making you suffer. The words hit me like physical blows. This wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. This was Jake explaining how my attempt to murder him had improved his technique. You're sick. Am I? Or am I just finally being honest about what I was really trying to accomplish? Jake reached for the folder again, pulled out a section I hadn't seen yet. Let me show you something else I learned during my time in the woods. The papers he spread across the table were different from the others. These weren't photographs or financial records, they were profiles. Detailed psychological assessments of people I knew. Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor. Tom Williams, who owned the hardware store in town. Even Deputy Martinez. Each profile contained personal information, psychological vulnerabilities, specific details about their fears and insecurities. What is this? Research. During my 3 weeks of observation, I had plenty of time to study not just you, but your entire community. To understand how people think, what motivates them, what frightens them. I flipped through the profiles, seeing my neighbors and friends reduced to clinical assessments and potential manipulation targets. Why? Because you showed me something important, Clayton. You showed me that when you really want to hurt someone, I mean really destroy them, you don't attack their body. You attack everything that gives their life meaning. Jake's voice was getting more animated, more excited. You could have just punched me, or thrown me out of your house, or told me to shut up. But none of those things would have really solved your problem, would they? What problem? The problem of me existing. The problem of someone in your life who could see through your comfortable illusions and force you to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself. Jake stood up again, started pacing with nervous energy. So you didn't just attack me, you tried to erase me completely. Remove me from existence so you could go back to living in your bubble of self-delusion. I told you why I did it. You told me what you told yourself. But the real reason, the deeper psychological motivation, was that you couldn't tolerate having your worldview challenged by someone you couldn't dismiss or ignore. Jake stopped pacing, looked at me with that same clinical interest he'd once applied to my garden. And that gave me a wonderful idea. I felt something cold and terrible settling in my stomach again. What kind of idea? Well, you tried to solve your problem by making me disappear. But what if I solved my problem by making everyone else disappear? The words didn't make sense at first. Then, slowly, horribly, I began to understand what he was suggesting. Jake, what are you talking about? I'm talking about a more systematic approach to dealing with people who don't meet acceptable standards of intelligence and behavior. He gestured toward the profiles scattered across the table. All of these people, your neighbors, your friends, your entire little community, they're just like you were before I started trying to educate you. Comfortable in their ignorance, resistant to growth, clinging to outdated beliefs and inefficient practices. They're good people. Are they? Or are they just people whose limitations you've learned to tolerate because they don't challenge your own? Jake sat back down, his expression becoming more focused, more intense. Here's what I realized during my time in the woods. Trying to educate people individually is inefficient. It takes too much time, requires too much patience, and ultimately fails because most people are too psychologically invested in their ignorance to change. So maybe the solution isn't education. Maybe the solution is selection. The word hung in the air between us, loaded with terrible implications. What do you mean, selection? Jake smiled that horrible, satisfied smile again. I mean identifying the people who contribute positively to society, the intelligent, the educated, the capable, and finding ways to ensure their success and influence. And the others? The others, well, accidents happen, don't they? People fall into creeks. They have car troubles on isolated roads. They experience unfortunate coincidences that remove them from positions where they might hold back human progress. I stared at my grandson, finally understanding the full scope of what he was proposing. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about optimization. Social engineering. The same principles that apply to improving agricultural yields or streamlining business processes, applied to human populations. Jake leaned forward, his eyes bright with intellectual excitement. Think about it, Clayton. What if we could create communities where everyone was intelligent, educated, capable? Where ignorance and stupidity weren't tolerated or enabled, but simply absent? You're insane. Am I? Or am I just applying the lessons you taught me about the practical limits of patience and tolerance? Jake reached across the table, gathered up the profiles and photographs with methodical precision. You know what the beautiful thing is about this approach? What? It's completely sustainable. Once you establish the right standards, the right selection pressures, the system maintains itself. People either adapt to meet acceptable levels of intelligence and behavior, or they experience unfortunate accidents that remove them from the equation. Jake stood up, tucked the folder under his arm. And the best part is, it all looks completely natural. Just a series of tragic coincidences that happen to affect the least valuable members of society. I felt like I was falling into some kind of nightmare, unable to process what I was hearing. Jake, you can't be serious about this. Can't I? You tried to kill me because I made you uncomfortable. How is this any different, except in scale and efficiency? It's completely different. How? Explain to me the moral distinction between killing one person who annoys you and killing multiple people who hold back social progress. I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it. The logic was horrible, but it was logic. Jake had taken the worst impulse I'd ever acted on and turned it into a philosophical system. Besides, Jake continued, it's not like I'm planning to do this alone. What do you mean? Jake's smile grew wider, more genuine. I mean that during my 3 weeks in the woods, I wasn't just observing your community. I was making contact with like-minded individuals. People who understand that sometimes, progress requires difficult choices. What people? People who've had experiences similar to mine. Intelligent, educated individuals who've been held back by the mediocrity and ignorance of those around them. Jake walked toward his car, then stopped and turned back to face me. People who understand that the real problem isn't individual ignorance, it's systemic tolerance for ignorance. And systemic problems require systemic solutions. He opened the car door, then paused. Oh, and Clayton? Don't worry about whether you should report this conversation to anyone. Who would believe you? And even if they did, what law have I actually broken? Thinking about something isn't a crime. Jake got into his car, started the engine. But thank you, he called through the open window. Thank you for showing me what real power looks like. Thank you for teaching me that some problems can only be solved through direct action. He drove away, leaving me sitting on my porch with the taste of bile in my mouth and the terrible certainty that I had created something far worse than anything Jake had ever been before. I had tried to kill a cruel, arrogant young man. Instead, I had created a monster. That was 6 months ago. 6 months since Jake drove away from my house with his folder full of profiles and his head full of terrible ideas. 6 months of waiting for the other shoe to drop, for news reports about mysterious accidents affecting the most vulnerable members of our community. But nothing happened. No unexplained deaths, no tragic coincidences, no systematic elimination of the people Jake had deemed unworthy. Just silence. At first, I convinced myself that he'd been bluffing. That his talk about selection and optimization and like-minded individuals was just psychological warfare, one last attempt to make me suffer for what I'd done to him. But as the weeks passed, I began to understand that Jake's silence wasn't evidence of abandoned plans. It was evidence of careful preparation. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks after Jake's visit. Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor, mentioned that she'd been getting strange phone calls. Someone claiming to be from various government agencies, asking detailed questions about her finances, her health, her daily routines. Probably scammers, I told her, but something cold twisted in my stomach. Those questions sounded like the kind of information Jake would need to build one of his psychological profiles. A month later, Tom Williams at the hardware store told me about a young man who'd been coming in regularly, asking questions about tools and equipment. Nothing unusual about that, except for the specific nature of his interests. Wanted to know about things like rope tensile strength, which chemicals shouldn't be mixed together, how to disable safety features on power tools, Tom said. Smart kid, asked good questions, but something about him made me uneasy. When Tom described the young man, I knew it was Jake. By the time winter arrived, I was seeing signs of his presence everywhere. Neighbors mentioned helpful young people who'd offered to do odd jobs around their properties, installing new locks, checking electrical systems, examining the safety of old structures. All of it perfectly innocent on the surface, but taken together, it painted a picture of systematic surveillance and preparation. And then, 3 weeks ago, it finally began. The first was Martha Kelly, a widow in her 80s who lived alone on the outskirts of town. Died in her sleep, according to the coroner. Natural causes: heart failure brought on by advanced age and poor health. Nothing suspicious about it, except that Martha had been in good spirits when I'd seen her at church the Sunday before. Sharp as a tack, talking about her plans to visit her grandchildren in the spring. The second was Bill Crawford, a local farmer known for his strong opinions and his resistance to modern agricultural methods. Died in a farming accident, got caught in his own hay baler, according to the sheriff's report. Tragic, but not unheard of. Farming is dangerous work, especially for men in their 60s who've been doing things the same way for decades. The third was Jenny Martinez, Deputy Martinez's younger sister, who had developmental disabilities and worked part-time at the local grocery store. Car accident on a rainy night. Skidded off the road into Miller's Creek, the same creek where Jake was supposed to have drowned. Her body was found 3 days later, trapped underwater by debris. 3 deaths in 2 weeks. All of them tragic, all of them explicable, all of them affecting people who would have appeared on Jake's list of society's less valuable members. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. People die in small towns all the time, especially during winter when roads are dangerous and elderly residents are vulnerable to illness. But I couldn't shake the memory of Jake's smile when he talked about optimization and selection pressures. The excitement in his voice when he described creating communities where ignorance and stupidity were simply absent. That's when I started my own investigation. I drove to every location where the deaths had occurred, looking for signs of Jake's involvement. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. At Martha Kelly's house, I discovered that her new locks, installed by that helpful young man just 2 weeks before her death, were the kind that could be opened from the outside with the right tools. The kind that would leave no evidence of forced entry. At Bill Crawford's farm, I found tire tracks in the mud near his hay baler. Fresh tracks from a car that didn't belong to Bill, made on the morning of his death. At the creek where Jenny Martinez died, I discovered something that made my blood run cold: fresh scratches on the guardrail, exactly the kind of marks you'd expect to see if someone had used a crowbar or similar tool to weaken the barrier before an expected impact. Jake wasn't just killing people. He was doing it with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to analyzing my garden. Each death was carefully planned, expertly executed, designed to look like a tragic but natural occurrence. But it was when I went to the county library and started researching the other deaths that I realized the true scope of what was happening. Over the past 6 months, there had been dozens of unusual deaths across a 3-county area. All of them affecting people who shared certain characteristics: elderly, disabled, poorly educated, financially struggling, or simply resistant to change and modernization. A homeless veteran who'd been found frozen to death despite the relatively mild winter weather. An elderly man with dementia who'd somehow managed to lock himself inside his own root cellar. A woman with intellectual disabilities who'd apparently gotten confused and walked into traffic on a busy road. A traditional craftsman who died in a workshop fire that destroyed decades of his work. Each death was explainable, each investigation was closed quickly, and each victim was someone that most people would describe as society's most vulnerable members. But taken together, they formed a pattern that was unmistakably systematic. Jake had been busy. And he hadn't been working alone. I found evidence of at least 3 other individuals involved in the operation. Young, educated people who'd moved to the area recently, who'd taken jobs in healthcare, social services, and emergency response. People who would have access to vulnerable populations and the knowledge to make their deaths appear natural. The network Jake had hinted at during our conversation was real, and it was operating with terrifying efficiency. That's when I knew I had to act. Not because I felt guilty about creating this monster, though I did. Not because I wanted to save the remaining people on Jake's list, though I did. But because I finally understood what Jake had been trying to teach me during that last conversation on my porch. He'd been showing me that intelligence without conscience is the most dangerous force in the world. That education without empathy creates monsters far worse than any ignorant bigot or violent criminal. Jake and his associates weren't killing people in fits of rage or moments of passion. They were killing them after careful analysis, systematic planning, and rational consideration of costs and benefits. They had turned murder into an intellectual exercise. And they were getting better at it. 2 weeks ago, I drove to the state capitol and walked into the FBI field office. I sat in a sterile conference room and told 3 federal agents everything I've told you, about Jake's month in my house, about my attempt to kill him, about his survival and transformation, about the pattern of deaths I'd discovered. I showed them the evidence I'd collected, the connections I'd made, the terrible logic underlying what appeared to be random tragedies. The agents listened politely, asked detailed questions, took copious notes. They told me they'd investigate, that they took these allegations seriously, that they appreciated my coming forward. Then they did nothing. Oh, they went through the motions. They reopened a few of the death investigations, asked some follow-up questions, examined the crime scenes I'd identified. But their hearts weren't in it. Because here's the thing about systematic elimination of society's most vulnerable members. A lot of people, even good people, aren't entirely upset when it happens. Nobody really mourned Martha Kelly's passing. She'd been sick for years, had no close family, was mostly a burden on the healthcare system. Nobody questioned Bill Crawford's farming accident too closely. He'd been resistant to safety regulations, had injured himself before, was probably going to hurt someone eventually. Nobody investigated Jenny Martinez's car crash too thoroughly. She'd been a poor driver, had gotten confused before, was likely to have more accidents in the future. Each individual death was easy to dismiss, easy to rationalize, easy to accept as a tragic but not entirely unexpected outcome. And that's what made Jake's system so brilliant, so terrifying, and so difficult to stop. He wasn't killing people that society valued. He was killing people that society barely noticed were gone. Last week, I got a phone call. No caller ID, but I knew who it was before I answered. "Hello, Clayton." Jake's voice was exactly the same, calm, controlled, intellectually curious. "I heard you've been busy lately. Talking to federal agents, making wild accusations, trying to cause trouble for me and my associates. Someone has to stop you." "Stop us from what? We haven't broken any laws. We haven't committed any crimes. We've simply facilitated some tragic but natural outcomes for people whose continued existence wasn't contributing positively to society. You're murdering innocent people. Are we? Or are we just helping natural selection work more efficiently?" The clinical detachment in his voice was exactly what I remembered from our conversations 6 months ago. Jake wasn't angry about my attempts to expose him. He was curious about my motivations. "You know what's interesting about your federal investigation, Clayton?" "What's that?" "The agents you spoke with were surprisingly receptive to the idea that maybe, just maybe, some of these deaths weren't entirely accidental." I felt cold dread settling in my stomach. "But they were also very interested in your own story. Your attempt to murder your own grandson. Your history of violence and deception. Jake, they're reopening the investigation into my disappearance, did you know that?" Taking another look at your story, examining the physical evidence, interviewing witnesses. You're alive. You can tell them it was self-defense. Jake laughed, that same horrible sound I'd heard echoing from above while I was drowning in his contempt. Oh, but I'm not going to do that. You see, I've learned so much from our relationship, Clayton. You taught me that sometimes the most effective way to deal with a problem is to let natural consequences take their course. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you're going to be arrested for my attempted murder within the next few days. The federal investigation gave local authorities the push they needed to take another look at what really happened on that bridge. I sank into my chair, feeling the weight of what he was saying. And once you're in prison, facing charges for trying to kill your own grandson, who's going to believe your wild stories about systematic elimination of undesirable populations? The evidence that a mentally unstable old man collected while obsessing over imaginary conspiracies? The evidence gathered by someone who already tried to commit murder once and might be looking for ways to justify his actions? Jake's voice was getting more animated, more excited. You're going to be the perfect scapegoat, Clayton. Every unexplained death, every suspicious accident, every tragic coincidence, it'll all be attributed to your delusional fantasies about organized killing. People will figure out the truth. Will they? Or will they be relieved to have a simple explanation for complex problems? Jake was right, and we both knew it. My credibility was destroyed the moment I pushed him into that creek. Everything I said from now on would be filtered through the lens of my own violence and instability. But don't worry, Jake continued. I'm not going to let you rot in prison indefinitely. That would be wasteful. What do you mean? I mean that prison can be a dangerous place for elderly men who've committed crimes against family members. Accidents happen. People fall down stairs, have heart attacks, experience unfortunate encounters with other inmates. You're going to have me killed. I'm going to let natural selection take its course. Same as always. Jake paused, and I could hear that familiar smile in his voice when he spoke again. You know what the beautiful irony is, Clayton? What? You tried to teach me a lesson about consequences by pushing me into that creek. You wanted me to understand what it felt like to be powerless, to be at someone else's mercy. Yeah. Well, mission accomplished. I learned that lesson very thoroughly. And now I'm going to teach it back to you. The line went dead. That was yesterday. This morning, I saw the federal agent's car pull into my driveway, followed by 2 state police cruisers. I'm recording this story while they're setting up outside, preparing to arrest me for the attempted murder of my grandson. In a few minutes, they're going to knock on my door, read me my rights, and take me away to face justice for my crimes. And Jake will continue his work, eliminating society's most vulnerable members one carefully planned accident at a time, protected by the perfect cover of my own failed attempt at vigilante justice. I want you to remember this story. I want you to think about what happens when intelligence is divorced from compassion, when education becomes a weapon instead of a tool for building better communities. I want you to understand that the real monsters in this world aren't the obviously evil ones, the violent criminals, the angry bigots, the cruel dictators everyone can see coming. The real monsters are the ones who convince themselves that their cruelty is rational, their violence is logical, their hatred is justified by superior knowledge and understanding. They're knocking now. Time to go face the consequences of my choices. But before they take me away, I want to say this. If you've ever felt powerless against someone who used their intelligence to make you feel small, if you've ever been dismissed or diminished by someone who thought they were better than you, remember that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, education without empathy is destructive, and intelligence without conscience is the most terrifying force on earth. Don't let them win by becoming like them. Don't push your grandson into the creek. Learn from my mistakes, and maybe, just maybe, you can stop the next Jake before he starts optimizing human society by eliminating everyone he deems unworthy of existence. The door is opening now. Time to face what I've done. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the people in your own life who've used their intelligence as a weapon, Hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because the only way we stop people like Jake is by recognizing them before they have the chance to turn their cruelty into a system. Remember, education should build people up, not tear them down. Intelligence should serve humanity, not judge it. And wisdom, real wisdom, always includes compassion. Don't let the monsters win.